Welcome to MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things magic. In this video, we are going to discuss the quintessential cards needed to build the core of a Lands Matter commander deck with Omnath, Locus of Creation as its general. Omnath, Locus of Creation, hails from Zendikar Rising and is a 4/4 legendary elemental for red, green, white, and blue mana. Whenever Omnath enters the battlefield, we draw a card. Omnath also has Landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control, we gain 4 life if this is the first time this ability has resolved this turn. If it's the second time, we add red, green, white, and blue mana to our mana pool. If it's the third time, then Omnath deals 4 damage to each opponent and each planeswalker we don't control. In the core of this build, Omnath will be slinging this direct damage early and often. The power of this iteration of Omnath lies in its landfall abilities. The core of a Lands Matter EDH deck helmed by Omnath focuses on all things land, and this video will be no different. The core will surround Omnath with spells and effects that synergize with lands and the landfall mechanic. By focusing on lands as the catalyst of this build, we will out-resource and outvalue our opponents on the path to imminent victory. We begin the core of this build by adding some powerful landfall triggers. Lotus Cobra adds 1 mana of any color to our mana pool. Tireless Provisioner either creates a food token or a treasure token, which is life gain or mana acceleration, respectively. Tireless Tracker creates clue tokens, which we can pay to, tap, and sacrifice in order to draw a card. Tatiova Benthic Druid provides card draw and life gain. Valakut Exploration gives us card advantage and deals direct damage to our opponents equal to the number of cards left in exile at the beginning of our end step, while both Tunneling Geopede and Spitfire Lagak deal 1 damage to each opponent whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control. Scute Swarm can completely take over a game if left unchecked. It creates 1/1 green insect creature tokens, but if we control 6 or more lands, instead it creates tokens that are copies of itself. Similarly, Felidar Retreat can get out of hand very quickly. This enchantment provides the option of creating 2/2 white cat beast creature tokens or putting +1/+1 counters on each creature we control. With these 2 cards in this type of build, 1 round of turns can produce a very wide and very tall army of creature tokens. Speaking of creature tokens, if we control 7 or more lands with different names, whenever Field of the Dead or another land enters the battlefield under our control, we create a 2/2 black zombie. Emerald Angel creates 1/1 white birds with flying, Zendikar's Royal creates 2/2 green elementals, and Rampaging Baloths creates 4/4 green beasts. Greensleeve's Marrow Sorcerer creates 3/3 green badgers and has protection from planeswalkers and wizards, in addition to having power and toughness equal to the number of lands we control. Omnath, Locus of Rage creates 5/5 red and green elementals, and whenever it or another elemental we control dies, this version of Omnath deals 3 damage to any target. We continue with some utility landfall effects. Whenever a land enters the battlefield tapped and under our control, Tiller Engine either untaps that land or taps target non-land permanent an opponent controls. Royal Elemental allows us to gain control of target creature for as long as we control Royal Elemental, while Emeria Shepherd returns target non-land permanent card from our graveyard to our hand. If the land that triggered this ability happens to be a plains, then we may return that non-land permanent to the battlefield instead. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control, if it's our main phase, then Morog, Fury of Akum, gives us an additional combat phase after that phase. At the beginning of that combat, we untap all creatures we control. As a bonus, each creature we control gets +1/+0 for each time it has attacked this turn. Morog is a very powerful win condition in Lands Matter builds. There are some powerful creatures that synergize beautifully with a battlefield inundated with lands. Avenger of Zendikar creates a number of 0/1 green plant creature tokens equal to the number of lands we control when it comes into play. It also puts a +1/+1 counter on each plant creature we control whenever a land enters our side of the battlefield. Phylath World Sculptor is similar to Avenger of Zendikar, but is more limited in its token production and +1/+1 counter dispersal. It creates a number of 0/1 green plant creature tokens equal to the number of basic lands we control, and puts 4 +1/+1 counters on target plant we control whenever a land enters the battlefield on our side. Although restrictive, Phylath still has value in this type of build. Multani, Yavimaya's avatar, has reach and trample and gets +1/+1 for each land we control and each land card in our graveyard. Multani has a recursive ability that allows us to pay 1 and a green mana and return 2 lands we control to our hand in order to return Multani from our graveyard to our hand. These bounced lands serve as more landfall trigger fodder. Triggering our landfall abilities is paramount to the success of this build. Ancient Green Warden ensures that these abilities trigger an additional time through its presence on our side of the battlefield. As a bonus, we may play land cards from our graveyard. As we will see later in this video, establishing various outlets for playing lands permits us to activate our landfall triggers every turn if land cards are absent from our hand. Now that our battlefield is teeming with various landfall effects, it's up to us to put as many lands into play as possible. Exploration is the gold standard here. For just 1 green mana, this enchantment allows us to play an additional land during each of our turns. For triple the cost of exploration, Azusa Lost But Seeking gives us 2 additional land drops during each of our turns. Dryad of the Elysian Grove lets us play an additional land, and as a bonus, it fixes our mana by making all lands we control every basic land type. Wayward Swordtooth follows suit with another extra land drop. Mina and Den Wildborn does the same, and has an activated ability that can bounce a land we control to our hand to give target creature trample until end of turn. Aisi, Tyrant of Gyre Strait, gives us another land drop, in addition to drawing us a card whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control. Playing lands and drawing cards. Is there anything better in Magic? Kodama of the East Tree could be an all-star in this type of build. Whenever another permanent enters the battlefield under our control, if it wasn't put onto the battlefield with this ability, we may put a permanent card with equal or lesser mana value from our hand into play. As we have showcased already, we have a lot of landfall effects that create tokens. Tokens have mana values of 0. Do you know what else has mana values of 0? Lands. Imagine a scenario with Kodama and any combination of token-creating landfall effects on our side of the battlefield working in unison. That is downright terrifying for our opponents. Cultivator Colossus has its own play a land and draw a card engine. Whenever it enters the battlefield, we may put a land card from our hand onto the battlefield tapped. If we do, then we draw a card and repeat this process. The process continues until we run out of land cards in our hand, or we decide to stop. Each of these dynamics can get out of hand very quickly, especially if there are any peripheral card draw effects like Tatyova, Benthic Druid, or Aisi, Tyrant of Gyre Strait, on our side of the battlefield at the same time. If the stars align in our favor, then Burgeoning could provide immense value. Whenever an opponent plays a land, we may put a land card from our hand onto the battlefield. If any of our opponents are fearful of our landfall synergies, and they should be, then perhaps they decide not to play any lands at all. This also works in our favor. Our opponent's self-imposed denial of resources will stunt their tempo while we continue to build our board state. Putting lands into play from our hand is not the only option available for triggering our landfall abilities. We can use the top of our library as an outlet as well. Not only does Oracle of Moldiah permit us to play an additional land during our turn, we also may play lands from the top of our library. However, we must play with the top card of our library revealed. Same thing with Courser of Kruphix, except the additional land drop is replaced with a landfall ability that gains us 1 life each time a land enters our side of the battlefield. For players who wish to keep their cards a secret, these abilities may be deal breakers. But no worries, there are other top-of-the-library options. Rada, Heart of Keld, lets us play lands from the top of our library without having to play with the top card of our library revealed. As a bonus, Rada's activated ability makes her a game-ending threat based upon the potential size of her temporary power and toughness boost. Augur of Autumn mimics Rada's peek and play a land ability and extends it by permitting us to cast creature spells from the top of our library if we control at least 3 creatures with different powers. This should not be a cumbersome feat in this build. Now let's dig deeper into our library in order to get as many lands onto our side of the battlefield as possible. Both Kodama's Reach and Cultivate achieve the same result for the same mana value. 1 basic land into play tapped, and a 2nd basic land to our hand. Harrow puts 2 basic lands from our library into play at instant speed, while Roiling Regrowth does the same, but the lands enter the battlefield tapped. Springbloom Druid is a creature, but plops 2 more basic lands from our library into play. Each of these cards cost 2 and 1 green mana and require us to sacrifice a land in order to fetch out these 2 basics. Upping the mana value to 3 and 1 green mana, Explosive Vegetation puts 2 basic lands from our library onto the battlefield tapped. Circuitous Route can do the same, but provides an option to fetch gates instead of basics. Migration Path is a copy of Explosive Vegetation, except we could cycle it away to draw a card instead of casting it. Keeping pace with the 2 mana per land card fetched is Nissa's Renewal, which lets us search our library for 3 basic lands and puts them onto the battlefield tapped, in addition to gaining us 7 life. For even larger returns on our mana investment, for 6 and 3 green mana, Reshape the Earth puts 10 land cards from our library into play tapped. We could also cast Scapeshift. We sacrifice any number of lands we control, and then search our library for that many lands and put them onto the battlefield tapped. So far, our hand and library have been the main sources for putting lands onto the battlefield. Now it's time to turn our attention to our graveyard. Crucible of Worlds, Ramunap Excavator, and Perennial Behemoth allow us to play land cards from our graveyard, while Splendid Reclamation returns all lands from our graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Another option for playing lands is to bounce them back into our hand from the battlefield. With trade routes, we can pay 1 mana and return a land to our hand. We can do the same with Miloku, the Clouded Mirror, while also creating a 1/1 blue illusion creature token with flying when we do so. For trade routes, we can also pay 1 and discard a land in order to draw a card. This same discarded land can be played from our graveyard with any of the aforementioned cards that let us play lands from our graveyard. The various synergies that these 2 cards have with the core of this build make them powerful win conditions in a lands matter deck. It's time to bring this video to a close by including some cards that synergize with and strengthen the landfall theme of this build. Root Path Purifier makes all lands we control and land cards in our library basic. This means that the aforementioned ramp spells, such as Kodama's Reach, Roiling Regrowth, Migration Path, and Nissa's Renewal, searches for any lands in our library and not just traditional basics. Zurin Orb has a 0 mana value and allows us to easily get lands into our graveyard by sacrificing them to this artifact and gaining 2 life each time. Remember, we can easily use our graveyard as an outlet for putting lands into play, but we need to have lands in the graveyard in order to do so. Zurin Orb helps us do this. Since we're running a 4-colored build, there are a lot of lands that could enter the battlefield tapped, therefore stunting our tempo somewhat. Whenever a permanent enters the battlefield tapped and under our control, Amulet of Unvigor will untap it. Awaken the Woods creates X 1/1 green Forest Dryad land creature tokens. Each of these land creature tokens triggers our landfall abilities when they enter the battlefield. Another way to trigger our landfall abilities is with Ashaya, Soul of the Wild. This elemental makes non-token creatures we control forest lands in addition to their other types. These non-token forest land creatures have summoning sickness, so without haste, we can't tap them for mana until our next turn. However, they will trigger our landfall abilities when they come into play, which provides more versatility for the purposes of triggering these abilities as much as possible. Fetch lands are definite considerations for the land base of this build, but perhaps the most important single land may be Fabled Passage. We can tap and sacrifice it and search our library for a basic land card and put it onto the battlefield tapped. But if we control at least 4 lands, we untap that land instead. We will easily control at least 4 lands. Fabled Passage costs no life to activate, and we have numerous ways to enable us to play it from our graveyard multiple times during each of our turns. As a bonus, if we have the aforementioned Root Path Purifier on our side of the battlefield, then Fabled Passage fetches any land from our library. An outside-the-box win condition in landfall-themed builds is Warp World. It's a little chaotic, and it may help our opponents, but we should benefit from it the most due to the high number of landfall abilities stuffed into the core of this build. Each player counts the number of permanents they own, then each player shuffles those permanents into their library. Remember, tokens are permanents, and they will count towards the number of permanents shuffled into our library. Next, each player reveals cards from the top of their library equal to the number of permanents that player counted. All artifact, land, and creature cards revealed this way are put onto the battlefield. These cards all enter the battlefield and see each other at the same time. Then, all enchantment cards revealed this way are put onto the battlefield. All other revealed cards are put on the bottom of their owners' libraries in any order. Once everything is put onto the battlefield, we put all of our triggered abilities onto the stack accordingly, and then each player in turn order does the same. Yes, there may be some scary permanents put onto the battlefield under our opponent's control, but remember, since the core of this build is focused on landfall abilities and triggering them as much as possible, we are more prepared to benefit from this sorcery than our opponents. There should be very few scenarios in which the battlefield is not completely tilted in our favor after casting this spell. If you haven't already, then I recommend embracing the chaos and warping your world. And if you do, one last recommendation is to include a copy of Urabrask the Hidden. If this creature is put onto the battlefield with Warp World, the game should be over right after our combat phase. This video provided a blueprint for building the core of a Lands Matter commander deck around Omnath, Locus of Creation as its general. Removal spells, disruption, ramp, and the land base can vary from build to build, and also are dependent on metagame preferences and availability. The cards discussed during this video are suggested options for crafting a focused landfall build around Omnath, in addition to providing ways to optimize this theme. Let me know your thoughts about these recommendations in the comment section below. This is MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things magic.